fixed wireless is clearly a great way to do broadband. It's become increasingly popular over the last few years, and quantifying its growth and its impact and its role in where fiber fits in. That's something that Jimmy Schaeffler, right? Jimmy, that's how I say your last name, right?
That is correct. Thank you.
This is something you've been doing for a long time, but you have a new report that follow up to an earlier one, and this report is called Liftoff. So why don't we talk about Liftoff and that clever title, what that clever title means, what this report's about?
Well, to start off, the real story of this began about 5 years ago when the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association hired the Carmel Group to do the same report. And at the time, we did separate surveys of vendors and of operators. We had literally hundreds in each category. And we also did about 30 90-minute interviews before and this time as the foundation for the data and the analysis. And then on top of that, we did typical online research and other types of analysis to put together what is the final report that was issued last week. And so the real objectives of this are to tell the real story about fixed wireless and hybrid fiber wireless in North America circa 2021, and to get some real reliable data out there for policymakers and financiers, funding sources, and then to give the industry stakeholders some real good tools to further their business operations. That's where we're headed.
Well, one thing that kind of stood out for me is the number of operators. You said a minimum of 2,800 operators are out there right now. It reminds me of the old cable days in many ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really good comparison. And what we're finding now is that it's very likely that that is a conservative estimate, because when I spoke to people, they said an awful lot of that number turns on how you define a fixed wireless operator. And if a broader definition is provided, some people said that they wouldn't be surprised if there was a number that could be supported in the range of 4 or 5 times that 2,800. So that was a shocker to me. But when all is said and done, I kept ratcheting back to something I could support. And 2,800 is a growth of several hundred over what we saw 5 years ago. And what's interesting is there's a push and a pull there. The one side of that is that 2,500 a year ago, there has been met with consolidation. So that 2,500 number has gone down on that side of it. But on the more important side, which is the growth side, there are more and more people who are reading our report, and more people are talking to their neighbors and talking to other vendors and reading what's online and reading what's in the financial sources and realizing that this is a pretty damn good business to be in.
Well, and there's also, you talk about hybrid fiber wireless, but there's also a lot of hybrid players as well in terms of, I know of electric co-ops that are doing both fiber to the home as well as wireless. And of course, there's independent telcos and even cable companies that are, have elements of wireless too. Right.
We saw that some of the big players getting into this was a real motivation for a lot of growth. So AT&T and Verizon being an example of a couple of those, they're expected to grow tremendously in the number of subscribers and the amount of resources that they put into fixed wireless. It's interesting because I write a column for multi-channel news called Mixed Signals, and we named that about 10 or 15 years ago. The idea at that time was satellite could very well become cable, and cable could become wireless, and wireless could become fiber, and all of those could become mobile cellular. The customer ultimately doesn't care. They just want the bits on their screen. They want the content. They want it to be affordable. They want it to be quality. They want it to download properly. And so when all is said and done, you're going to see in that hybrid world, it's not just going to be fiber and fixed wireless. It's going to be a lot of other combinations, not the least of which might very well be low Earth orbit satellites. But that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah, we could spend a day just on that.
Indeed.
So from a kind of a business perspective and talking about that scaling, and you've already touched upon a little bit the consolidation aspect, do you see are some of these smaller operations going to be kind of sucked up, or are they going to try to remain kind of community based and really customer centric, or is it a game ultimately kind of like a cable industry?
Well, the really good ones are, even though they get big, going to still put a lot of resources into maintaining an image and a practice of locality. Locality is going to keep them ahead of the large incumbents. That is something that's proven true time and time again, not only in interviews with actual subscribers, but actually too with the interviews that we did of the operators. Operators who are savvy realize that if they can get to the customer sooner and they can convince the customer of their local base, of their local caring being a key word, and that they're going to be there sooner and they're going to be there better, then they're going to get that word of mouth, which ultimately is the best marketing tool in the world. You know that as well as I do, Ken.
Yeah, and from a market standpoint, it seems like having that local presence is a huge advantage.
Yes, absolutely.
And so from a fiber standpoint, that's one of the other things I found interesting is that some of the companies that started off as wireless have now started to do a little fiber to the home in some of their areas. Is this a strategy where they kind of establish themselves with the wireless and then create a longer term network? Or
well, as you probably know, and I imagine you've spoken about it in several of your initiatives, the federal government right now is very keen on the idea of future proofing their networks. And I think that's a little bit of a fallacy, because that to too many people in Washington, D.C., as I understand it right now, means that fiber is the only answer. And that's ridiculous. You wouldn't have Elon Musk doing what he's doing right now with Starlink were it only going to work in a fiber world. There will be lots of pipes into homes of every type all over the world and certainly all over North America. That said, in, let's say, a swampy area like Louisiana, or let's say a mountainous area like Colorado or Idaho, you're going to be greatly challenged if you figure the only way you're going to future-proof your network is by having fiber in the ground, or even fiber on a tower, or fiber, meaning fiber from pole to pole, as in what you would string on telephone lines. That's not the only answer. It can't be the only answer. And then what's also really interesting from a technical standpoint right now, and we've seen this clearly in the last 5 years, is the bandwidth that fixed wireless is going to be able to, using the rules of physics, expand to, is going to really surprise a lot of people. We're talking about 100 megabits becoming more and more the norm. And we're talking already about 25 down and 3 up no longer being the standard that everybody in the fixed wireless world is expected to live by. Many of the vendors are finding better answers and are doing it really quickly and doing it affordably for the customer.
Yeah, I can think of one example of an electric co-op where I believe they're doing fiber in the mountainside because it's harder to actually get the wireless there. But in the valley, they actually have some fixed wireless. And again, part of it is just how do they get to market fastest, and serve subscribers.
And what we're finding too, I think you'll see this if you study the graphic that we put together. It's the green graphic with the towers. You're seeing that all of a sudden out in the middle of nowhere, there will be a new construction development. And it won't be connected by way of other buildings to the main town or the main city miles and miles away. It's just out in the middle of nowhere. And what we found is that some of the really savvy fixed wireless operators will deliver their backhaul in the form of point-to-point wireless. And then when it's received in the housing development from a distant point, it will then be distributed down into the fiber and distributed house to house by fiber. So that's a perfect example of the hybrid fiber wireless combination, and how the really smart operators are just going to look at different housing units, different locations, different towns, different cities differently, and they're going to come up with unique custom solutions for those particular entities, whatever they are.
Yeah, I guess they all become tools in the toolbox, right?
Yes, yeah, and so it's that same thing again, like I was talking about before with the idea behind the mixed signals column. The really good operators, as I see them going forward, are going to be the cable operator who buys a fixed wireless operator. They're going to be the mobile cellular who tries to figure out how to also add fixed wireless. They're going to be the fixed wireless operator who starts cozying up to a telco. There are going to be all kinds of different combinations, with the idea that the real thing that they do is not deliver by way of a certain pipe. They deliver bandwidth. They deliver broadband. They deliver ones and zeros. And in the end, coming back to the old, rather trite adage, customers don't care. They just want the content.
Well, and from an operations standpoint, I'm curious if you're seeing kind of the delivery of a common experience. So whether it's fiber or wireless, from an operator's perspective, they can provide them that same kind of whether it's a managed Wi-Fi or what have you at the end. And it looks kind of the same from an operations standpoint, as far as managing the customers' homes and so forth. Is that a trend as well, or?
Well, to be honest with you, that's not something we looked at specifically, and it's not something that's come across the transom quite a lot just yet, but it's something that, now that you mention it, we'll probably start looking at it more, because I know in a lot of ways you're a lot more tied to some of this stuff than we have been. We were specifically tuned in for the last 18 months on this study into almost 80 or 90% fixed wireless, and probably about 10 to 20% fiber. But at the same time, when you're looking at a really good study, you're looking at the competition. And so we have a chart that looks at comparative economics, for example, and we put a lot of time into that. And I'm really proud of that chart, because it's a more recent iteration of what we did 5 years ago. And you won't see that chart anywhere else. We really scrubbed the numbers. We really thought hard and long about what's in it. If you look at the number of footnotes, you'll see there are a lot of qualifications, which shows, again, that we put a lot of time and effort into it. But the bottom line is fixed wireless is just a really value-laden, really economical idea for getting broadband into people's homes.
Yeah, the capital costs were much lower, right, to get that out there. And so your return on investment was much faster, as I recall.
Right. And at the same time, your average revenue per unit is expanding every year. We estimated that for the average fixed wireless operator today, it's close to $60, and it's going to climb, not precipitously, but it's a steady rise. At the same time, overall revenues are rising. And what's amazing too, Ken, and you'll see this in the report, it's one of the last charts in the 30 pages of the report, is churn. Churn is just stunningly low. And that's because what we hear from operator after operator is, once you sign up the customer, you give them that good local-based customer service, they don't leave. They just keep paying month after month, and the cash flow gets better and better.
Well, and it's not just rural areas either. Some of the companies you profiled are in urban areas as well, right?
Yeah, there's a company that's Boston-based, and it's Chet Kanoja from Starry.
Oh, right.
And Chet has a long background, as you probably know, going all the way to the United States Supreme Court, challenging the traditional nodes of operation. And Starry is a perfect example of that. One thing that the Carmel Group has been real excited about as a trend, and I think we're going to see more and more of that, is the idea that there are some really important corporations and businesses out there that cannot afford to be down, which means they can't afford to have a wire into their Long Island facility and have a hurricane come through and wipe it out for a week. So they're better off to have a redundant internet connection by way of fixed wireless that might cost them $500 a month, but that $500 a month is replaced the first day when you've lost $500 worth of one employee's work because they can't get online. So if you have that redundancy, you cover that base.
Yeah, that's a topic that's not discussed a lot when they're talking about broadband infrastructure. The fact that in the US, we have multiple means to do that, and that's a great example of kind of an insurance policy, if you will, right?
Right. And so we were looking in this report at a lot of trends that will guide the business as going forward. And that was just one of them. Another trend that we think is really important is that there will be more and more subscribers that are businesses. And they will be, for example, your local coffee shop or your law firm or a hospital in a rural community. And that will be because the overall package is very attractive. And people are coming off the understanding that it's not just rural residential. It can be urban residential. It can be urban business or non-residential. It can be exurban. It can be suburban. More and more the industry is realizing, and a lot of the vendors are particularly on board with this growth as well. They're realizing that the equipment and the spectrum and the business model and the return on investment support every kind of subscriber.
And I would imagine, going back to the urban area, that because you're not putting a line into every home, or you don't have to build every home, that suddenly you don't need to necessarily get the same kind of penetrations you would if you were building a terrestrial infrastructure.
That is exactly part of the idea behind the business model. Starry has had remarkable success, as I understand it, talking to them. They're still growing rather substantially, and they are proving that model. I'm predicting too that within the next couple of years, there will be a couple of really interesting investments of bigger telecom providers looking at the Starrys of the world and thinking to themselves, this could be part of our piping. This could be part of our distribution too.
Do you see any outsiders potentially coming in? I remember hearing a presentation 15 or so years ago about the idea of Walmart putting WiMAX towers on all their, Walmarts. They could cover 80% of the country or something. So I'm just wondering, do you think there could be an outsider potentially using the wireless technology?
Well, let's just say I would be surprised. This is a greenfield in a lot of ways. There are so many uncertainties and there are so many new opportunities here and so many positives that I know a lot of people are looking at it. I've seen banks look at it. I've seen all kinds of financiers look at it. I've seen lots of different kinds of telecom companies look at it. And I think that there's going to be somebody who's in a position with probably very deep pockets, who is a lot more risk adverse than your average business person. And they're going to look at this industry and step in and say, maybe it's time I bought one of the bigger providers. Maybe it's time I bought into a system that has 70 or 80 or 150,000 subscribers right now and add that to my existing base of whatever kind of distribution I am. But the kind you mentioned is interesting too, because Walmart offering up some kind of a fixed wireless operation would not be in addition to what they've already got. It would be something brand new. And that gets us back to that greenfield idea. When all is said and done, you want to have not just really good business people behind something like that. You want to have really good technology people too. because the technology is so critical to doing this properly. That said, the technology is getting simpler and simpler and more elegant and more affordable.
Well, I guess the other challenge is bandwidth. And I think you kind of alluded to it in the report about some of the, the CBRS opening up. You've got, the Wi-Fi 6E with, 1.2 gigahertz or however, 850 megahertz or whatever. So there's lots of potentially unlicensed or semi-licensed by rule bandwidth. But what are your thoughts as far as the bandwidth?
Well, let me just read to you, if I may, something that I did in my research for these questions you had presented me. The FCC's Auction 105 for the experimental CBRS band came to a close late last month, netting the U.S. Treasury $4.543 billion, a total of 228 20,625 of the 22,631 licenses available. WISPA members figured prominently in the auction, an important first for companies that have traditionally served communities through unlicensed spectrum. With almost 70 WISPA members, that's the trade group, placing winning bids for more than 3,600 licenses at auction. These companies are putting it into action to serve the unique needs of their marketplace and individual customers. Many are using it, the PAL and GAA spectrum, to augment service already in their markets. Others are using it to provide specialized enterprise offerings. I think that's probably better than I could do off the top of my head. That really zeroes right into on it. So thank you for indulging me that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because it is the first time kind of the WISPA type members have really had a kind of a licensed, in this case by rule approach, right, to spectrum. Typically, it's been done on unlicensed bands.
Right. Well, what you'll see in the report is we have broken out 3 types of bandwidth. One, of course, is unlicensed. The other one is licensed. And there's a third, the lightly licensed, which means that there are requirements, but they're sort of it's like Goldilocks and the 3 bears. It's in the middle of all of that. And you had mentioned before, just now, the idea of different kinds of bands. I wanted to talk just a little bit about 6 gigahertz. And again, this is reading some of the research I did. Referring to 6 gigahertz spectrum, 850 megahertz for WISP use. Yes, that is a great thing. The technical rules and the AFC issues are being worked out so that it can provide new capacity to providers. More spectrum is always a good thing in a resource-restrained marketplace. When it comes online, it will be put to great and flexible use. And so that's, once again, the 6 gigahertz of spectrum and the 850 megahertz for WISP use.
Yeah, and I remember from the webinar we did last year on this, the providers were elated that, that announcement had just come out and they were elated by that.
Yeah, and that gets to another trend that the study highlights, and that is that a lot of the policymakers in Washington, D.C., and that's not just the people on Capitol Hill, that's the people over at the FCC, they are starting to appreciate fixed wireless. And they're starting to appreciate it not only in the way of providing a lot of money that has come into it in the last couple of years, but as importantly, they're paying a lot more attention when the WISP Trade Association goes to the different agencies and says, we need more support when it comes to more spectrum. We need you to not just smile and reach out to the known incumbents with the deep pockets. We need you, if you're going to really fill this broadband gap, to reach to a wider swath of operators. And that includes the fixed wireless little guys, mid-sized guys, and even some of the big ones.
Yeah, it definitely takes away a barrier to implementation, right? I mean, if you have to raise $80 billion to buy a spectrum, that's a lot of capital or whatever the numbers are, right?
Right. The amount of money that's gone in the spectrum in the last few years, and especially in the last couple of auctions, has just been unheard of 5 or 10 years ago. Just jaw dropping, and that's a great thing for our treasury. That's a great thing for our economy. But at the same time, when all is said and done, it has to fit a business model. And
yeah, ultimately, the consumers are going to have to pay for it, right? In their cell phone bills or whatever, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And so figuring out how to balance that ability of the customer to pay more and more and more versus the cost of getting the basics, that's always going to be the main challenge of every business.
So one of the things you basically, I think you came up with Schaeffler's law. It's kind of like Moore's law, except I think it said in the report that every 5 years it double, and so you're expecting in 2025 to I forgot the number. Is it 10 or 11 million subscribers on wireless, fixed wireless?
I think that our estimate takes us close to 12 to 13 million by 2025, okay. And that's about 8 to 10% of what we figured to be that marketplace by that time. So that said, it's gone from near zero about 20 years ago to about 10%, and it's going to keep growing. A lot of that has to do with the competition, Ken. As you well know, cord cutting is going to help fix wireless. There's no question about that. And people no longer being as bound even to broadcast technology, replacing it with fixed wireless technology, that might provide an avenue for one of the more rare alliances. Maybe broadcast starts delivering its signal by way of fixed wireless. Stranger things have happened. But the bottom line is, if you have a good pipe into people's home, then there's a great opportunity for creativity and innovation. The sky's the limit as to what content can be delivered.
Well, and that's what I was wondering, if you're seeing any of the operators, doing any bundling at all, whether it be voice, video, or whatever.
Not much, I'd have to say. There are a few instances of ancillary services that we discovered in the survey. There are things like security that are provided on the side. There are other kinds of businesses that tie in with a fixed wireless operation and make a lot of sense. But for the most part, they're not yet quite making a real trend out of doing video content deals. They're content, most of them, to doing a really good job of just providing the pipe.
It makes sense. I mean, you start to add a lot of overhead when you add those things in.
Yeah, but at the same time, a lot of overhead can also amount to a lot of potential additional revenues if you do it well.
Yeah, sure. And like you say, if you have enough volume of customers that, to support it.
Right.
From another ancillary service, I think you touch upon a little bit, the whole idea of IoT and machine to machine, whatever you want to call it. Are you seeing many of them get into that kind of offering, or is there much there for them to offer?
I think there is a lot there for them to offer, but that is, again, in that realm of greenfield. Again, one of the research notes I had says to that question, this has many applications that WISP can and do use to sell their services. IAG tracking and other industrial monitoring uses are just two among many. So that's something that's mentioned in the report. It's not studied in the report just yet because we just didn't find enough traction in the surveys to support that. But it's pretty much a no-brainer. If you've got bandwidth and you've got burgeoning needs, let's say vehicles being just one of them, then you're going to want to use whatever bandwidth you can find. So yeah, Internet of Things is going to fit right in there.
Yeah, and some of these technologies like the LoRa, I guess you said, LoRa, whatever it is, some of those technologies are pretty easy to implement. It seems easier to implement than, the fixed wireless service, at least from what I've seen.
Yeah, the low bit rate services to Internet of Things and machine-to-machine products are going to make a lot of sense, and they're coming. And it's just a question of when, not if, in my mind.
Right. Yeah, and then it probably has to do a lot on the client side with, I was looking at the LORAS site today, and there's so many sensors. You can get like sensors for garbage cans that will automatically send you a note, hey, it's time to empty this garbage can by the bus stop. But I can't imagine our bus system here in Santa Clara County actually implementing anything like that for whatever reason, right? But they should. But
when you talk about examples like that, Ken, I can't help but think of a title that we came up with a while ago. It shouldn't be called the Internet of Things. It should be called the Internet of Life. Because ultimately, from a pacemaker to some kind of a transmission device in your hip or in your knee after you've had a surgery, or something in your eyeball, or something, God knows where in either your body or your vehicle or your home, everything's going to be connected. And so that's going to create amazing opportunities for everything in life.
Yeah, clearly. It's it's exciting because just the growth is not only going to, as you kind of pointed out, they'll grab market share, but it sounds like it's going to continue to grow the pie bigger for everyone.
It's amazing, because every now and then I think to myself, well, how much further can technology go? How much really more is there to do in terms of use of frequencies in spectrum bands and devices and silicon and all of the things you see at the Consumer Electronics Show, or you saw until the last couple of years at the Consumer Electronics Show. But there really is, when you go to one of those shows, the realization that, in a lot of ways, we're just getting started. We have so far to go when it comes to what technology will do for us. And so we have to keep going there, but at the same time, we have to be really careful that, like Facebook did today with our former president, that we are protecting ourselves.
Well, it's a very interesting time because, like you say, all these technologies, especially as we start to look at things like IoT and, Internet of Life, whatever you call it, they're, obviously there's some great benefits, but then, what are the downsides as well? It's becomes challenging to balance all that, I guess.
Yeah, it does. I don't know if I'm putting words into your mouth here, Ken, but I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about the idea of challenges. And
yeah, I did want to ask you about what you saw as the challenges to your forecast, right?
Yeah, it's not all greenfield and it's not all blue skies. Fixed wireless and hybrid fiber wireless have obstacles that they have to overcome. And we identified competition, government process, vertical content, meaning content that's offered by these huge incumbents that fixed wireless operators are a long way from ever being able to deliver, spectrum challenges, and funding. And you had asked me what it must take to overcome some of those challenges. So competition, I identified just a short phrase to address that: fair playing fields for operators. In other words, that the competition by offering vertical content can't be so much bigger and so much better and so much richer that the fixed wireless operators, no matter how good their local service is, cannot compete.
And so from that standpoint, is that about bundling and things like that, where they can wrap together packages that are just so attractive because they might have, they might own content, for instance, or whatever?
Exactly. What a Disney can do, what a Comcast can do, just by virtue of their control over so much of the content, ABC and NBC and the networks being examples of that, to say nothing of Comcast's cable footprint and ABC's broadcast TV footnet, all the owned and operated stations across the country. That's just one example. So when a fixed wireless operator comes into what is usually in that competitive environment, a larger town or a city, they are very challenged, because that incumbent can come in and provide value to the customer that's hard to overlook. And so there, in a perfect world, there would be ways where that playing field could be made a little more level. Going back to a couple of the other things, government process, better lobbying by the fixed wireless side of the business, but fair ground rules by those who set it up in a place like Washington, D.C. Spectrum challenges ensure great selections of government administrators. In other words, when you have people at the FCC who can do a great job and are great civil servants, that really helps to overcome that spectrum challenges issue. And then funding, the fixed wireless industry needs to keep telling and demonstrating in real life that it has a great story.
Well, and I've seen, some of these operations where they've really been bootstrapped. I mean, it reminds me again back to the cable industry, and it's probably in some ways easier to bootstrap it because you're not having to actually go out and build the plant. You have to put up a tower and stuff and go to the home. But does that help a lot as far as, that lower cost of entry?
Well, one example I have is I looked at the idea of possibly opening up a fixed wireless system myself in Monterey County, where I resided. And I looked at the normal kind of way, the traditional kind of way, which would be a big tower up on a big hill. And what I found out right away is there were lots of tools in the tool set. And so somebody introduced me straight away to small cell and said, look, you see that small cluster of houses down there? We could put a antenna on each of those telephone poles, and we could service those clients much more cheaply, much more efficiently, and provide an amazing value. So I think that's a really good example of how today's fixed wireless operator can be ubiquitous in an awful lot of situations. There are very few places where a point to multi-point tower can't somehow be set up for a big cluster of houses.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, it's also obviously that's the other thing too. It depends on where you are. So if you're in the Midwest and you have these towers and you have great line of sight, that's clearly different than Louisiana, where there's lots of trees and swamps, or where you are in the Monterey area with mountains and stuff.
Right. But what we're seeing too, Ken, is that there are more and more answers to line of sight problems. And there are uses of spectrum and creations of consumer premises and antenna equipment that will help to alleviate that. I won't say get rid of it, but will create solutions that can make that more of an answer where it wasn't 20 years ago.
Yeah, and again, it probably gets back into the toolbox thing where you might use a certain band, 60 gigahertz or something, maybe for backhaul, and then use another band for getting into the house and so forth, right?
Exactly. Very often what we're finding is the license purchase by an operator is for the backhaul band. And then the unlicensed takes over when it comes to delivering point to multipoint.
Okay.
So again, another example of multiple tools in the chest.
But to your larger point, you're talking about the challenges of funding, of just where you're going to raise that capital to get started and then moving forward as you build out, I guess.
Yes, exactly. One thing that we're finding, just the Carmel Group, is we're getting inquiries more and more from people who have money. And I won't say any particular kind of entity, but they want to learn how they can take advantage of the opportunity here by either lending to vendors or lending to operators, or by purchasing operators, or by merging, or somehow accumulating and partnering with different parts of the business. So money, in addition, private money and government money en masse is coming into the industry right now. And there's no way that cannot help ultimately to bring more broadband to more of the digital divide that doesn't have it right now.
Yeah, I just keep going back to, I keep thinking of things like Jones Intercable and TCI in the early days, and how they, made their business model was kind of, acquiring companies and aggregating them into something bigger, I guess. It just seems like that'll happen at some point.
One of the examples of the case studies in the report is a Texas-based company by the name of Nextlink. And they have been on a mission to acquire new operators. And they are predicting that right now they are right around 70,000 subscribers and roughly 500 or 600 employees, and growing all the time. There are more and more of those. There used to be only a handful of those, maybe one finger's worth or one hand worth of fingers. Now it's quite a bit more. Companies are seeing that the subscriber model is a good one, and it's a competitive one, and they see opportunity in size. But then again, we get back to that point we made at the outset. Their real challenge is to convince the subscriber that they're still a local company and they still care about them.
Right. Yeah. You don't want to lose that as you're busy consolidating and busy. Yeah.
If possible.
Yeah. I mean, that was early days of cable, right? A lot of issues with that where they're, customer service was like the third thing down on the list. Just getting that network up and running was the first, and then keeping it running was always a challenge too, just because of the nature of it as well. But
I'd be curious, and I come back to you with this question, Ken, because in a lot of ways, this stuff as well or better than I. But where you are in San Jose, what is offered in the form of fixed wireless in your town that you're aware of?
Yeah, no, I guess I can name names. What the heck? George Guinness's company Sail Internet is one. The folks up in the guys who are doing 60 gigahertz, Common Networks
in San Francisco.
Yeah, and they're in San Jose as well. They just were purchased by another company up in San Francisco. So those are two. And interestingly, Sail, I tried to get them to my neighborhood, and they had challenges just paying for the price, to get roof access. But I've noticed they've got it now because I actually got a postcard from them. Common Networks, I actually had them come out, had them put it, start to put the dish on the roof. And as they're putting the antenna on there, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I spent so many years, we remodeled their house. Do I really want an antenna on my roof again? And I was kind of glad when they couldn't have a line of sight. It was off just a little bit. Maybe if they'd gone to the other side of the roof. And I said, I think I'm okay with what I have because I do have fiber to the home. I'm very lucky. And so I said no, even though I think they really, coming at this from scratch, they have a really good customer support system. Self-care as far as setting up the appointments. I was really impressed with that. And I want to support these alternatives because it does seem to provide a baseline level of competition, which hopefully will keep prices in check. And I think it's good to have 3 or 4 choices if possible. So,
inevitably, in most instances, our population grows. We're hearing now it's not growing as quickly as it used to in decades before. But every time you have a new person on this earth, most of those want to have a cell phone and they want to have connectivity. And so the amount of bandwidth each person is going to require is going to increase, and the amount of people is going to increase. So it's not like you're ever going to look at any one pipe and say, well, that's going to be the only way we're going to deliver them what they need. There are going to have to be a lot of solutions.
And it does create this, the thing you think of, well, gee, why do you need to have multiple? Can't you just have one and just have monopoly and get monopoly pricing? But there is something to be said for having that resiliency of having multiple networks, the redundancy of it. It not only makes them more competitive and provide better services, but it also gives you that insurance policy you're talking about.
Well, let's face it, that one of the beauties of capitalism is competition.
Exactly.
And if you can make your competitors stay awake a little later at night or get up earlier in the morning so that they can serve your customer as well or better than you can, everybody wins.
Yeah, one of the interesting things when the pandemic started, there's this number going around in San Jose that, and I don't necessarily believe the number. It's been out there for about 4 or 5 years. It was based on a Stanford study, which the study was a survey. And they say that 94,000 people out of the million people in San Jose don't have internet access, which translates to maybe 47,000 homes or whatever. And there is certainly some number that don't have internet access. I don't think it's because there aren't passings. I think everyone could have it, assuming they could afford it or they would want to have it. But the city of San Jose, spending millions of dollars to create their own kind of Wi-Fi network, and I just have to think that if the school districts partnered with some of these wireless companies and said, hey, you get roof access, we've got fiber drop here, and you can pay us for bandwidth, and you have to give our students, maybe you give them an education package and it's free for, and they get this is the package. It's a walled garden for the education package. And then, you can sell the rest. It just seems like there could be some really creative solutions to getting to those people who need it, who can't afford it, and using resources that are already there. Anyway, I digress.
No, you digress intelligently, but you did lose me when you said Stanford because I'm a Cal guy.
Oh, there you go. Yes, obviously it was a bad study, right? So
yeah, well, terrible metaphor. But the bottom line is that there are right now creations, innovations, solutions that are being cooked up by people you'd never expect to be into this, and they are going to ultimately find traction because they just make sense. And so maybe it's the top of the Transamerica building in San Francisco, or the new Salesforce building there, or the Bay Bridge, or the Golden Gate Bridge. It's gotten to the point where you can put a multi-point tower on that location and do amazing things. And you're getting to the point too where the elegance of those pieces of hardware is so remarkable that you're not angering municipalities anymore. You're not angering businesses and customers that see that device wherever it is, because it's so small. Most of the devices are smaller than your DirecTV or Dish satellite dish, and that's 18 inches. So as it comes down and as all of this fluidity of creation develops, there are going to just be a crazy number of situations. Let me just give you one that's really interesting. I went up to visit a guy a couple years ago named Adam Brodell, who is in the Placerville area. He climbs trees, 115, 120 foot high ponderosa pine trees, and he puts his antennas that work amazingly well in the trees. And I remember when I wrote on one of the WISP forums about this, everybody said, oh, nobody uses trees. That's nuts. That's crazy. They don't work. They sway too much. For Adam Brodell, it works amazingly well. So that's just one example, Ken.
That's amazing. No sighting issues with that, right? You're just no permits.
Well, I'm not sure about all of those details, but I remember just the idea. He had a box at the base. He had a wire that went up the tree. He had lightning resistors up at the top, and he had an antenna. And he reached enough houses with that multi-point signal to make it of value to him.
That's very creative.
Yeah.
And I imagine that's one of the things that creativity was probably a big theme of your interviews and so forth.
Yeah. What we had is we had 70 questions in
Wow.
in each of the surveys, which actually was quite a lot. And we wish we could have made it less, but we wanted there to be consistency in each of the sets of surveys from 2017 to 2021. And so we kept pretty much the same categories, the same questions. And so we could do questions back and forth and comparisons that from one cycle to the next cycle. And that gave it a consistency that we wouldn't have had otherwise. But there were a lot of really precise and a lot of really interesting questions, but more so there were a lot of really interesting individual answers.
And imagine you're going to start work on the 2025 report here pretty soon then, huh?
That was discussed with a couple of the key individuals already today.
Yeah, and you've got as far as the sponsors. I mean, it's a who's list of this industry as far as who's behind it besides WISP, some of the other players as well.
Yeah, we've had some real good support, not just from some of the bigger, deep-pocketed players, but to me, what's as important and really a better testament to its value is from several very small operators, where their subscriber base is in the thousands at best, as opposed to some of the big ones like Nextlink, which I mentioned, where their subscriber base is going to probably come up around 100,000 in the next year or so. So it's all over the range.
That's great. And it's available freely downloadable, right?
Yeah, just go to the Carmel Group website, which is www.carmelgroup.com, and scroll down and please accurately fill in the access data and it's yours.
Excellent. Well, Jimmy, it's been great catching up with you and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Ken. Keep up the good work.